Thanks everybody for being here. Before I start, let me arrange this. Is this good? Can everybody hear me? Thank you. So before I begin, I wanted to say thank you so much to the BSA, especially Erin and Caitlin, for everything that they've done to organize this event taking place, and of course for us three being here today. I also wanted to extend thank you to Leah Price and Ann Coro, my advisors, who have patiently sat with me while I think through the process of this research. The Folger Shakespeare Library, whose librarians I see here, who hosted me for a couple of months last year, and some of these pictures that you're going to see today come from that research, part of that research. Also the AAS. Some of the pictures here are also part of a program I attended this past summer. And most importantly, the librarian Raquel Abello from the Biblioteca Patrimonial Recoleta Dominica in Chile, who very patiently and very thoroughly sat with me revising most of the examples that I'm going to show to you today. So I wanted to extend an applause to all of our librarians today and their patience while we do our research. Without further ado, the housekeeper forcefully tosses Don Quixote's books out the library's top window directly into the courtyard. She throws them away, one after another, sometimes two at a time. In Miguel de Cervantes' famous scrutiny of Don Quixote's library, the characters of the priest and the barber, alongside Alonso Quijano's housekeeper and niece, perform a bibliographic purge. They go through most of Don Quixote's books to get rid of those authors guilty of his madness. While they save some editions, books are taken from their shelves, opened, inspected, passed around, and judged only to end up flown into the house's courtyard and corral. This episode, known by many bibliophiles, has been previously analyzed by literary critics as a satirical commentary on canon formation and censorship practices of early modern Spain. Today, I will look at the discarding mechanisms at play. In late 16th century Castilla, the spaces of the courtyard and the corral, a dirt patio dedicated to the upkeep of animals, plants, and domestic social life, were usually associated with the disposal of everyday waste. At the time, it was so common for people to discard their garbage from the windows of their homes onto the street or the corral, the local governments of metropolitan Iberian and colonial cities had to constantly release ordinances to regulate and manage waste overflow. According to historian Luis Arauz, the main function of the Castilian courtyard was to dispose of domestic residues, especially sewage. To have access to such a space meant people could throw away garbage without leaving their property, which was particularly comfortable for those that lived in urban settlements where street littering had been forbidden by law during the reign of Alfonso X. As a result, people perceived the corral as a site for transmutation where residues that could no longer be reused morphed into the elusive category of trash. When Cervantes choreographs the scrutiny of the library, he not only stages a complex inquisitorial process, but does so by representing the housekeeper's bibliographic weeding as a performance of waste disposal. Books that cost Alonso Quijano muchas hanegas de tierra de sembradura, meaning a lot of money, end up discarded in the same way other domestic scraps would. For the early modern reader, the simile between the handling of a library and the handling of kitchen scraps was disturbing and most likely funny. Because of how books were understood culturally, this operation disrupted their narrative as both a symbolic and material artifact. On the one hand, it meant to throw away an object of recognized social and exchange value, and on the other, to do so ignoring its material as part of a waste reuse economy. To tear a book's pages apart to use its remains in activities alternative to reading was common for purposes like wrapping, lining, scrubbing, and wiping. In his epigram, A uno que tenía muchos libros, the settler poet resident of the city of Lima, Juan del Valle de Caviedes, referred to the period's widespread practice of using the pages of books as toilet paper. I'm going to read the poem in Spanish, but you have the translation in front of you. Solo por buen parecer tiene Mario muchos libros, y mejor que en el estante estarán en su estantino. Caviedes uses the criollo Spanish term estantino, which means rectum or anus, to signal the use of the pages of books to clean one's stool after defecating. In other words, to wipe one's ass. Through the analogy of the terms estante, bookshelf, and estantino, asshole, Caviedes' epigram claimed that the ownership of books for the reprehensible act of seeming educated was worse than using them as what Anna Reynolds refers to as privy paper. In Caviedes' colonial Latin America, settlers and criollo nobility conceived of books and their materials as tools for the assimilation of contemporary continental trends and the imposition and dissemination of European ideologies. They were instrumental artifacts in the religious and humanistic education of children, the evangelization of indigenous communities, and the confirmation of literary circles ideally compliant with the regime. Because certain bibliographic materials were considered dangerous as they spread ideas that challenged the stability of the Spanish crown, its contents were often censored and their circulation forbidden. As a result, the quantities of books that circulated within the territory, like settler poet Diego de Mejia suggests in the prologue to the first volume of his translation of Ovid's Heroids, was abundant, yet delimited. During the first century of Hispanic settler imperialism, the books read and distributed in the Indies came mostly by way of the sea, often imported by religious orders in charge of education institutions and convents like the Dominicans, whose presence in the Americas can be traced all the way back to 1510s. Here you can see a couple of pages from a Sibyl of lading of the ship Jesus Maria y San Esteban that came from Seville to Peru, Lima in 1607. And if you pay closer attention, you'll be able to identify some of the books in the cajones or cases that came all the way through the Atlantic. Some of them, Fables of Esopo, the Emblems of Alciato are there. The commercial monopoly enforced by the metropole through the Holy Inquisition and the House of Trade limited the capacity of the viceroyalties to produce Western bibliographic materials on site, as well as to freely trade to acquire larger quantities and varieties of books. In consequence, the presence of a book's remains in commonplace recycling operations, like the wipings of one's ass in Caviedes' epigram, unsettled their value as artifacts for the establishment of imperial and religious power. Within the bookbinding trade, for example, the backing of spines, the making of pasteboards, and the reinforcement of end leaves and hinges, wrappers and book covers required scraps of other books or newsprints for the strengthening of a binding structure. As Adam Smith argues, the use of a text as waste created a dichotomy of the perceptual value of a copy. It implied that it had a low cultural status, given the ease with which it was torn apart, or that it had a high cultural status, as copies were so numerous, one torn book would not dent its position in the marketplace. Here are some examples of waste paper that you can find within pasteboards and also inside bookbinding practices. All of these examples, most of them are from the Folger Shakespeare Library. One book had to be dismantled or never bound in order for the bookbinder to have waste material available. Its presence inside a volume complicates our understanding of the chronology and survival of a text, as it enables multiple temporalities, mostly backwards looking, to emerge and participate from the same bibliographic artifact. While the European book industry settled in the Americas, colonial printing and bookbinding workshops recreated these techniques within the means and constraints of their local transatlantic economies. As Martha Romero explains, the history of colonial bookbinding is hard to reconstruct. Due to the lack of documental traces, institutional resources, and the relocation and rebinding of hundreds of volumes to centralized national libraries during the 19th century Republican era, or global North research libraries during the 20th, the historical development of a single bindery is almost impossible to track. However, it is safe to assume that educational libraries across the continent, like the one in the Colegio Imperial de Tlatelolco in New Spain, as Romero has proved, had accompanying binderies for the upkeep of their collections. The Biblioteca Patrimonial Recoleta Dominica, founded in the Dominican convent located in the central cabinet of Chile's capital in 1753, is one of the remaining libraries of the region, with collections that have been traced by historians like Miguel Lecaros back to the 17th century. This library has two primary colonial collections, one that used to belong to the convent of Santo Domingo, founded and shaped as an educational institution during the 1600s, and another original to the Convento Recoleta itself. In both of these collections, which I have closely documented, we can identify books that had, in contrast to generalized European trends of leather-covered pasteboard case bindings, the more common and widespread colonial American laced-in limb bindings of Spanish and Italian influence. In many of these copies, just like in the examples I have previously shown, we can find the pervasive presence of printed and manuscript waste paper. With the information we have today, it is not possible to say with certainty if these books were bound on-site or came bound from Spain during their many travels across the Atlantic. However, it is possible to characterize the relation between the waste paper used as end leaves and their host's textual blocks to create a typology of use and reuse of leftover reams and pages among period vellum bindings held in Southern colonial collections. Today, I won't discuss at length the ways in which these practices converge with those analyzed by scholars like Reynolds or Smith for local European waste economies, but we'll highlight those moments where the reuses of waste paper signal the colonial bound book as a transcultural artifact. So these are some examples of one of the taxonomy that I'm working on, where there are convergences with European examples. So I'm creating a relationship between, for example, the language and the places where the text block is produced, and the places and the languages of origin of the waste paper. We can talk later about how impossible it is to trace most of these waste papers. To do so, I have compared a range of 16th and 17th century text blocks, which include within their binding waste paper from different languages, periods, and non-Western materials, to discern how these artifacts position the colonial bound book in the framework of transhistorical bibliographic waste among larger transatlantic contexts. The grouping is twofold. First, we have the presence of a larger set of waste paper in other vernaculars, such as English, German, and Italian, that differ from those of the host text blocks printed in either Latin or Spanish. In the European cases, it's more common to find examples where the waste paper is either in Latin or in the vernacular that the text block is in. The wide presence of Italian waste paper might be related to Leccaro's observation that Dominicans had their provincial procurators in Rome bring most of the bibliographic volumes held in their American libraries. Second, a significant sample of the waste papers I traced have their origin in early to mid-19th century materials. Because bibliographic waste often preserves textual remnants of the objects it came from, which might or not prove useful to identify its provenance or trace it back to its source, it creates visible tensions between past and present. As a result, the histories of colonial bindings are hard to tell obeying linear periodical models. This is precisely what allows the study of bibliowaste to become itself a patchwork of interrelated, although seemingly anachronic historic episodes, as evidenced by the use of a Chilean 1837 broadside that narrates the embarkment of a national marine float of warships to join the Peruvian Ejército Restaurador against the Peruvian-Bolivian Confederation inside the vellum-bound book of a 16th century Cito San Austin copy of the Meditations. In binding, there are two types of conventional material practices. To use backward-facing materials that were produced before the creation of a text block, or forward-facing materials that were produced after the creation of the text block. When an object is bound within the political and geographical boundaries of its production site, it is more common for the materials to be backward-facing, as the binding usually occurs in a contemporary setting and within a local economy. When the object is bound, rebound, or restored in a colonial or post-colonial setting, the materials usually become forward-facing and are a witness to a different temporality. The broadside was, at least and for sure, glued to the parchment in Chile during the last years of the 1830s. Is it reasonable to say that these waste papers were attached and bound to the editions or collections within the library's bindery? What types of documents were deemed as binder's waste by viceregal or early Republican binderies? Were they using these documents as scrap paper inadvertently, or, like Don Quixote's volumes, they purposely found their way into the courtyard? A third grouping, and probably the most important, has yet to be found in colonial libraries belonging to the Viceroyalty of Peru, but has in those of New Spain by scholars like Marta Romero, those that include native indigenous bark paper or textiles as binder's waste. This practice, which requires further study, is a witness of the defacement of indigenous culture as well as the availability of these materials circulating within contact zone binderies. The study of books as waste complicates their notion as objects worth preserving. It foregrounds the tangible interactions between biblioartifacts and their users as they wear and tear its materials. Likewise, it raises questions about the history of their preservation and about contemporary practices and principles for their conservation and upkeep. My ultimate intent here, only briefly drafted, is to contextualize these fragments as well as its residues onto the larger and discontinued history of colonial bibliographic waste. Thank you very much.